Hey folks, this is assignment number 12 on tort liability, and I'm Matt McConnell. Here we go. So first of all, tort liability, you see the definition on the screen. It's a violation where one person causes damage, injury, or harm to another person. It could be intentional, it could be a breach of duty like negligent, which is, as you'll see, a lot of the cases that I have in this assignment are cases due to negligence or due to a violation of statutes. So the first case we're going to look at is Taylor versus Oakland Scavenger Company, which occurred in 1941. To give you an overview, it happened at Castlemont High School. They were ultimately ruled negligent. There was a 15-year-old girl who was in gym class. The gym teacher instructed the class to change, and they were going out to an athletic field to hold gym class. After she had changed, she was running ahead of the class in her exuberance to get out to the field, and she rounded a blind corner and was struck by a garbage truck. The garbage truck ultimately ended up rolling over her foot, crippling her foot and crippling her for life. So that's an overview of the case. To talk about some of the different measures that could have been taken or should have been taken. As a reaction, curriculum could have been reviewed. Dangerous activities can be eliminated. Like, for example, we know in most states dodgeball has been outlawed, and that's a result of issues similar to this where just dangerous activities in gym class need to be eradicated from the curriculum. Furthermore, activities that require students to leave the building or leave their traditional setting, they may have needed clearance after this event to make sure that it's appropriate and it's acceptable for them to be moving. Proactively, gym class should be restricted to the gym and possibly facilities that are accessible without crossing the street, because obviously the issue that we just talked about was an issue where they were crossing a street. They were transitioning to a different area beyond where their typical classroom setting is. Professionally, ethically, teachers really need to consider any safety risks prior to taking action. The old adage of it's easier to ask forgiveness and permission doesn't really apply here. It's our responsibility to make sure that the kids are safe, and it's our job to think about that. So it's important to maintain order, because if the teacher had required the students to walk with him or her in single file on the way to this athletic field, that could have resolved the issue as well. Second case we're going to look at is Daly versus Los Angeles Unified School District. That occurred in 1970. To give you a quick overview, two students after lunch, they were transitioning to their next class, which happened to be in the gym. They were unsupervised or insufficiently supervised, and the school was ultimately ruled negligent. What occurred was two students, while they were waiting for the end of the lunch period, they started slap boxing. There were a number of students who gathered around to witness, as we all seen with fights. Kids love to watch. So these two students were slap boxing, basically just demonstrating their speed and quickness without actually throwing real punches. But eventually, the student in question, his name was Michael Daly, he fell backwards and fractured his skull, which ultimately resulted in his death later. So some reactive measures. Teachers and monitors, they need to be assigned specific roles for lunch supervision. In this case, the teacher was sitting at a desk facing away from the students, not paying attention to them, and working on plans for future lessons. And so that's something that teachers and monitors need to have clear expectations of what is and what is not acceptable. Moreover, students will not be allowed free time after lunch. That would be another possible reaction to this. Instead, they could be required to stay in their seats during the lunch period, and then as soon as lunch period is over, then they can transition to their next class rather than moving and being concerned about whether they will or will not be supervised. Proactively, teacher roles and responsibilities need to be more clearly defined to avoid confusion and eliminate any oversights that could result in tragedies such as this. Professionally, if the teacher is assigned to monitor the students, was actively monitoring, moving around, interacting with students, instead of sitting at his desk, this whole situation could have been potentially avoided, which is a real tragedy. Next up, we have Barnett versus Caldwell. To give you a quick overview, the classroom teacher felt a need to step outside of the classroom and left students temporarily unsupervised. During this time, the students became rowdy. They were roughhousing horseplay. Two students ended up wrestling, and one student slipped, fell, and the student who was wrestling with him fell on top of him, that caused him to suffer injuries, ultimately leading to his death. The student was Antoine Williams. He died after sustaining injuries from this roughhousing, and the court ruled that the teacher was not liable in this case for Antoine's death. So in Barnett versus Caldwell, the school can draft clear expectations for staff on the responsibilities when supervising students. So I'm guessing this teacher was probably only planning on being out of the room for just a brief amount of time. Unfortunately, things can happen in just an instant. So the school needs to make sure that they clearly express and clearly communicate to their teachers, this is what's expected of you when you're monitoring students. Proactively, school rules such as keeping your hands and feet yourself at all times should be more prevalent and should be enforced more consistently. Obviously, if the students had not been roughhousing, had kept their hands and their feet to themselves, this issue could have been avoided. Professionally, the easiest way to say it is don't leave any students unattended. If students are in your care, you're responsible for their safety and health and well-being. Don't leave them unattended where things could happen that you or your district may be liable for you. If for some reason an emergency arises where you need to leave the room, you need to make sure you make arrangements for some other adult, some other school personnel to supervise your students in your absence. So if you do have to step out, you need to make sure that prior to that you arrange for an adult to supervise your students. The fourth case is Flanagan versus Canton. To give a quick overview, this is another one that happened in gym class. During the gym class, students became rowdy, they were roughhousing, they were horsing around, and this happened near the end of class. So the teacher pulled the students in, told them they needed to calm down, and sent them to the locker room to change at the end of class. During the time that they were changing in the locker room, an incident occurred where one student pushed another. The student fell into the lockers and into the benches, causing serious injuries. The court ruled that the teacher and the district were negligent, and this was based on the fact that the students had been misbehaving in class prior to the incident. And so that was a factor that measured into this decision of negligence. So some reactive measures. The school should consider providing more staff to supervise areas such as the locker room. So, for example, in most gym classes, it's co-ed and there's only one teacher. So obviously he or she can only be a male or a female, can't supervise both locker rooms. And so this is a potential issue just waiting to happen. And so the school may need to consider adding more supervision to make sure that kids are monitored at all times. Another option would be implementing single-gender gym classes to help alleviate this issue. That obviously might require some changes in staffing as well, so you have a male gym teacher and a female gym teacher present. Proactively, the teacher could have asked the students who had been rowdy in class, the ones who had been causing the issue that caused them to end class early, could have asked them to change at different times. This may have alleviated the issue to make sure that student A is pestering student B, have them change at separate times so that there's not a potential issue where they're unsupervised and can cause problems. Professionally, the teacher should have avoided leaving the students unsupervised. As we talked about in the last case, that seems to be a common issue. When students are unsupervised, things can happen that we are ultimately responsible to try and stop. But based on this ruling, it seems the school district has left the teacher in a really unfortunate situation and really needs to consider revising the setup to make sure that whoever the teacher might be is put in a place where they have a positive solution rather than issues that they can't ultimately fix. The last case is Munn versus the Hotchkiss School. To give a quick overview, the school went on a class trip to China. While on this trip, a student contracted an illness borne by ticks, and it was ultimately ruled that the district was negligent due to the responsibility to warn the participants about the inherent dangers on this trip. This one had quite an enormous payout. It ended up being a $41.5 million payout in this court case. So some reactive measures. The school should suspend all future trips until they shore up the language in their policies regarding trips in order to avoid future situations. So until they get this worked out, until they feel confident that they can handily navigate another class trip, they should cancel those or at least suspend those. Additionally, they should consider adding some simple language within the trip information and permission slips that warns of potential hazards such as this disease that the girl encountered on the trip. Proactively, the district should have included information regarding dangers on the trip, and that in this instance it was an illness borne by ticks, but that could be things, just inherent risks like climbing the mountain on the trail that they were using. That was another inherent risk that was mentioned with this case. That's something that participants and their parents and guardians need to be aware of. Professionally, it really comes down to communication. As most educators know, communication is paramount between school and home, and really between the teacher and students as well. So there seemed to be a communication breakdown here that ultimately put the school in a situation where they were liable. So simply communicating more clearly could have helped avoid the school being liable in this case. So that's all, folks. That's the 5 cases I reviewed, and there's your references if you're interested. Thank you.